Pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong have once again gained momentum. Anti-government protesters tried to ram their way into Hong Kong's Parliament building. The protesters stormed into the legislative building and carted away metal strips and dismantled sections of glass panes. Protesters battled police armed with pepper spray as they used trolleys to ram into the Legislative Council building. The series of protests are against the controversial bill that would allow extraditions to mainland China. These are live visuals coming to you straight from Hong Kong, where the protests are showing no signs of abating. This latest round of protests was sparked by a flag-raising ceremony that marked the city's handover from Great Britain to China 22 years ago in 1997. Early in the morning, large groups of protesters rallied outside the Hong Kong Convention Center, where the flag-raising ceremony was taking place, where police used pepper spray and batons against the anti-government protesters who had also seized highways and stopped traffic. Now, these pro-democracy protests are expected to continue further, as you can see with the live visuals on the screens. Late into the night in Hong Kong, protests continuing in full momentum. It's not the first time that the protesters have targeted the flag-raising ceremony, and today, on the anniversary day of Hong Kong being handed over to China by Britain, fresh protests have peaked in Hong Kong, where the protesters have stormed the legislative building. The government of Hong Kong has asked protesters to leave the building now. For all those who have tuned into this broadcast, this is the situation in Hong Kong as we speak. These are live visuals coming to you straight from Hong Kong, where protesters have stormed the legislative building and the Hong Kong government has asked them to leave the building now. This even as masked demonstrators have blocked key roads and highways in Hong Kong. Chaotic scenes in Hong Kong continuing for 24 straight hours, with no signs of the protesters looking like they are going to give up. Keep in mind, these protests on the anniversary day of Hong Kong's handover to China have been preceded by 3 weeks of protests against an extradition bill that would allow suspects from Hong Kong to be extradited to mainland China to be tried in the courts over there. It started off as a fight against that extradition bill, which was suspended by the government of Hong Kong, but has not been withdrawn. Protests have been continuing, asking for a full withdrawal of that bill. And these protests have now evolved into a wide civil liberties call. Keep in mind, Hong Kong is a special administrative region under China with its own political and judicial freedoms. But the people of Hong Kong now fear that those freedoms are being taken away one step at a time by the government in Beijing. And we'll continue to bring you live visuals of the protest situation in Hong Kong, where chaos continues late into the night. Protesters in Hong Kong have swarmed into the legislature building after nightfall. The police are backing off so that they can avoid any kind of a confrontation. Keep in mind, the excesses of the police to disperse protesters over the last 3 weeks has come under sharp scrutiny. But for now, on the anniversary day, police are avoiding confrontation with the protesters who have stormed into the legislative building. They broke the main door earlier in the day with trolleys and took out glass panes and more. And those protests have continued with high intensity. And now the legislative building of Hong Kong has been taken over by the protesters, but the police are backing off. They're avoiding confrontation, while the Hong Kong government has been telling the protesters to, quote-unquote, leave the building now. As you can see, protesters armed with umbrellas are taking siege of the legislative building. The situation in Hong Kong continuing to remain tense, with anti-government protests peaking on the day of the anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong by Britain to China. It was on this day, 22 years ago, that Hong Kong returned to Chinese rule, but under the one country, two systems principle, by which Hong Kong was granted great autonomy for the first 50 years. That's until the year 2047. But now, the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong have taken over the legislative building of the Hong Kong government. These are visuals coming to you live from inside the legislative building of Hong Kong, where chaos is reigning supreme as we speak. The government telling the protesters to leave the building now, police avoiding a confrontation, but the protesters persisting and taking siege of the legislative building. These are dramatic scenes that are unfolding as we speak in Hong Kong. Despite the calls of the government to leave the building, protesters continuing to stay within the building and registering their protests. In fact, from the visuals it's clear that the Hong Kong legislative building has been vandalized by the protesters. It's important to note here that for the protesters it's important that they continue to get the sympathy of the general public with their actions, because things could become very different if the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong lose the support of the public. Now, these protests in Hong Kong are said to be the biggest in 20 years. So why are people out on the streets, and why now? Well, today is exactly 22 years since the territory of Hong Kong returned to China from the British. That's also known as the handover. Protests are not new to Hong Kong, but what's happening now is being called the biggest demonstration ever. For one, in terms of sheer number of people, according to some estimates, in millions. The demonstration this year has been much larger than usual because of widespread opposition to an extradition bill. This Fugitive Offenders Ordinance Bill, if implemented, would allow suspects from Hong Kong to be extradited to the Chinese mainland to face trial in the courts over there. The move has set off alarm bells not only within Hong Kong but also in the international community. The fear is that critics of China in Hong Kong could potentially be extradited to mainland China to face trial in courts controlled by the Communist Party. What's more, it won't be limited to locals. Critics fear even foreigners and tourists could be picked up and sent to mainland China under the proposed law. But the government says the fears are unfounded. They say only people accused of serious and criminal offences would be extradited. Hong Kong, keep in mind, is a small territory which is now part of China, but it has its own legal system and judiciary. Hong Kong was a British colony. It was handed over to China by the British on this day, the 1st of July in the year 1997, and it was done on the basis of the principle of one country, two systems. The territory was promised civic freedoms and a high degree of autonomy for 50 years. Judicial independence in particular was guaranteed. But China watches Hong Kong closely, and the simmering discontent in Hong Kong is threatening to become a big political headache for President Xi Jinping. So the crisis and the protests are of a different scale this time around, although protests have been common in Hong Kong. In 2014, there was the Umbrella Revolution. It mobilized people against proposed electoral reforms. People used yellow umbrellas at that time to protect themselves from pepper spray. The protests ended only after a crackdown by authorities. In 2003, a new law sought to criminalize sedition and subversion against China. There were protests then too. They forced the Hong Kong government to withdraw that legislation. What happens this time remains to be seen. Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, was seen as competent. But now her reputation has taken a serious hit after the extradition bill fiasco. Hong Kong's focus has always been on commerce, but as these protests show, the people of Hong Kong are determined to fight for their political liberties and judicial ones too. And as we speak, the protests have evolved into a celebration inside the Hong Kong Legislative Building. Protesters have stormed the main hall of the Hong Kong Legislative Building. They've defaced some of the property over there. And now chants are being heard. The protesters have broken their way into the Legislative Building. The government is asking the protesters to leave the building now, but they are not leaving the building. They are staying on late into the night. Protests which began early in the morning, continuing with the same intensity late into the night in Hong Kong. This despite the police using pepper spray and batons to disperse the protesters. The police are backing off to avoid confrontation as more and more protesters stream into the Legislative Building of Hong Kong and take control. Keep in mind, protesters have also blocked off many key highways in Hong Kong.
It's okay, my bag is too big.
出晒啲搞晒，放晒啲 cam 搞過，啲 cam 成日先搞啦。你而家搞到你唔知今晚留得耐唔耐，留得落先搞。而家打個集中喺度搞先。
我冇收過工啊。10幾年都冇見過一單，好啦。